Today we're going to start talking about several different kinds of biologically important organic molecules. An organic molecule is they're the basis of the structure of every single living thing, and all organic molecules are going to contain carbon. Now, hopefully you just finished watching a video about all of the really interesting characteristics and uniqueness of carbon. And it's the ability of carbon to bond to so many different things that makes it a great building block for so many of these other molecules. We're going to start with an organic molecule called a carbohydrate. You may have heard of carbohydrates as things that should be in your diet, and a carbohydrate is based on carbo, which is the part of the word that means carbon, and then hydrate. If you're well hydrated, it means you've been drinking enough water. So it's a carbon and a water base. And so any molecule of a carbohydrate is going to have carbon, and it's going to have hydrogen and oxygen in a ratio such that there's going to be twice as much hydrogen as there is oxygen. So I have several different molecules listed here, and let's see if we can figure out whether these are carbohydrates or not. How about this one? Is this going to be a carbohydrate if its formula is pH3? No, it's not, because it doesn't contain any carbon. It can't be a carbohydrate if it doesn't have any carbon. How about this one? CO. Is that a carbohydrate? No, because it has carbon, but if it's going to have a water component to it, there has to be some hydrogen in it, and this doesn't have any hydrogen. So this one was not a carbohydrate. This one is not a carbohydrate. How about this one? This one has hydrogen and it has carbon. Well, what's the problem with this one though? Yeah, this one's missing oxygen. It's got to have carbon and hydrogen and oxygen in order to be a carbohydrate. So this is not a carbohydrate either. How about this one? This one has carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. Is this a carbohydrate? Well, in order for it to be a carbohydrate, the hydrogen and oxygen have to be in the right ratio. And so, again, if you remember the formula for water is H2O, I have to have twice as much hydrogen as I do oxygen. It has to be in a 2-to-1 ratio. Is that the case here? No. Here I have 4 times as much hydrogen as I do oxygen. So this is not a carbohydrate because the hydrogen and oxygen are not in the right ratio to one another. Well, how about this one over here? I have carbon, I have hydrogen, I have oxygen. Here are the hydrogen and oxygen in the right ratio, C4H8O4. Well, here, yes, because here I have twice as much hydrogen as I do oxygen. I have 8 atoms of hydrogen and 4 atoms, I don't know why I keep saying that, 4 atoms of oxygen. So there's twice as much hydrogen as there is oxygen. So yes, this one is a carbohydrate. Now, if I have the most simple carbohydrate that I have, that is called a monosaccharide. And she gives you on page, let's see what that is, page 60 in your book, she gives you several examples of a very common monosaccharide, which is C6H12O6. And so I'll show you that formula here, C6H12O6. And here you can see it has carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and there is twice as much hydrogen as there is oxygen. Now, just because I have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen does not mean that they're always arranged the same way. Sometimes the carbons can be arranged in a long chain, and other times the carbon can be arranged in a ring. And if you look again at the diagram on page 60, you'll see 4 different arrangements of these 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens, and they all look different from each other. But they're all considered a monosaccharide, and they're all considered very simple sugars. Now, I can take these monosaccharides and I can bond them together and make longer chains with them. They make more complex sugars. So if I take two monosaccharides and I hook them together, then I'm going to have a disaccharide. If I have a whole bunch of monosaccharides hooked together, I have a polysaccharide. So what I want you to do now is I want you to find this sheet where I said samples for videos. It looks like it has all these really interesting drawings on here. And we're going to go through how these molecules, simple molecules, can hook together. And while this may seem a little weird to you at first, every organic molecule that we talk about, they're going to use the same kind of reaction, and I want you to be able to recognize it. When you guys go to the dentist, have you ever noticed, well, you couldn't help but notice the suction thing that they sometimes stick in your mouth to suck all the spit out of your mouth? You know, the hygienist sticks it in there and goes, and it makes this awful noise. And then if then she sometimes maybe gets it caught on your cheek, it kind of sucks your cheek into the suction thingy. Okay, keep that in mind, because that's how we're going to look at these reactions up here, okay? So keep that thought in your mind for a second. I have drawn up here the same reaction that is on the top of your sheet, and this is also the same reaction that's drawn on page 61 of your book. Now, it is a little bit different because all of the carbons were not written in, and you will see this a little bit later on in your chapter 2. So there is, right here at the corner of this hexagon, there is a carbon right there. And right here at this corner, there's a carbon right there, even though it's not written. And so at every corner of the hexagon, except for this one right here where they have an oxygen drawn in, there is a carbon at each corner. And every carbon is allowed to have 4 things bonded to it. So if I look at this and I actually count up the carbons, and if you look at your paper, I think that they have that drawn in some really light blue so you could see the carbons. But if I count the carbons, I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's the C6 that we talked about. If you look at the oxygen, there's 1 here. So there's 1, there's 2, there's 3, there's 4, there's 5, and there's 6. Okay, so there's your 6 oxygens, and then there are 12 hydrogens. 1 plus 2 more there is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, C6H12O6. This is also C6H12O6, and I could go through and I can count all those as well. 1 carbon, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. You can go through and count the oxygens and hydrogens. What I want to point out to you, though, is that in the drawing that's on there, they did leave off one of the hydrogens, and it's the one down here at the lower right-hand corner. So you want to make sure you draw that extra hydrogen in right down here. Okay? Now, what happens is that these molecules get together, and there is an OH here, and there is a hydrogen right there. And so what happens is that these two go together to make water. And so this is where that suction thing that I just talked about, that's where this comes in. So you stick your suction thing in here and you go, and you suck that water out of there, and then this oxygen says, hang on a second, I only have 1 bond now. He wants to be bonded to 2 things. And so in order to do that, he's going to take where he used to be bonded to the hydrogen, and he's now going to go over and he's going to bond to this carbon where this OH was before, and it is now gone. So then if you look over here at this side, these 2 molecules that used to be separate are now bonded together, because all we did is we sucked that water out of there. And now, just like the suction thing gets stuck to your cheek, these 2 molecules are now stuck to each other. Now, the one thing that you need to do to make this absolutely correct is you need to go over here and you need to write plus H2O on the side right there, because otherwise the equation's not balanced, and we chemists hate it when equations aren't balanced. If it's on one side, it's got to be on the other side. So the two things that you need to do, make sure you stick that extra hydrogen in there, and then go in and write plus H2O on the other side, so it doesn't look like we just lost the water someplace, okay? This is called a dehydration reaction. And dehydration reactions are very good at hooking molecules together. You can actually turn the equation around and take these big complex things and add water to them, and we'll talk more about that later. And you can break them down into simple sugars again, but this is how we build very, very complex carbohydrates, okay? This is, when you put these two together, you get C12H22O11, which is basically the same compound as table sugar is. But they can get much longer and much more complicated than this. So the other sheet now that I want you to get out is the chart that I gave you. And mine actually has all the answers on it, which we're going to get to as we go through. But that other chart that I gave you, we're going to fill it out so that you have a basis to compare all of the different organic molecules. So the first row on there is going to be for carbohydrates. And so under building blocks for carbohydrates, you're going to write in monosaccharides, because as I just showed you, this was a monosaccharide, this was a monosaccharide. I hooked them together to make longer chains of carbohydrates, okay? Example sources, where can you find those in your diet? Well, anytime you have something like bread, or anytime you have anything that's got starches in it, that is going to be a carbohydrate. So breads and pastas, things like potatoes. Potatoes are an example of where plants will store their excess food, and then we kind of utilize what the plant has stored. So starches, if you're an animal or a human, you tend to store excess carbohydrates as glycogen, whereas plants store them as starch. You'll also find these complex carbohydrates in the cell walls of plants as cellulose, and so you'll find some of these different types of carbohydrates depending on what type of creature that we're talking about, okay? What are carbohydrates used for? Well, as I've kind of already alluded to, they're used for energy storage. So your potato plant takes the extra sugar that the plant makes and stores it down in the roots as potatoes. We utilize a lot of carbohydrates that the plants are actually storing as food for themselves and use it as food for us as well too. So that is the first class of organic molecules, carbohydrates, and hopefully you are beginning to understand what a dehydration reaction looks like. If you don't quite get it, you're going to see it again soon, I promise. So make sure that you've got your chart filled in with these other things as far as carbohydrates, and then we'll be looking at another example of an organic molecule the next time.